I'll do my best to stay within the time limits. I do encourage your questions at the end, so if you have any questions, no, it's fine. It's funny you mentioned the wow factor. We get so many requests at the Huffington Post for never been done before executions that we just created an acronym for it, NBDB. So now anytime something comes in, we all roll our eyes and say, okay, NBDB. But it's difficult. You're right. If you can overcome your fear, there's a lot of cool things that we can do. My name is Joe Van Brussel. I'm a director of content strategy at the Huffington Post in New York. Thank you very much for having me today, and a special thanks to Media Impact Polska for inviting me. This is a very exciting time, I think, in Poland for the native advertising industry. Through discussions that we had yesterday, it's very clear that a lot of people here have a very thoughtful, a very strategic approach to doing native the right way. That's very exciting. And over the last couple of years, I feel very fortunate to have been a part of this movement and to see it develop. So hopefully some of the learnings that the Huffington Post has undergone in the last couple of years will be of some use. So my presentation today is how branded content and advertising empower each other, the nature of native. And really, at the Huffington Post, we see these two things being able to work together and achieve different goals. And when they work together and achieve each of their separate goals in the right way, there can be really powerful results. So the subjects that we're going to cover today, number one, is what exactly is native advertising? There's already been some discussion today about the many different definitions and distinctions and the way people interpret this word. So I'm going to propose a definition that we can sort of dive into and really unearth the meaning behind these words. Number two is native advertising's relationship with display and how the two can work together. Again, each tool has very different uses, but when put together, they can achieve powerful things. Then number three is the future of content, a look at what's to come. That's going to be a very brief section on some potential worlds that we see should trends that we're observing today continue to sort of their logical end. So nice to meet you. I'm Joe. I don't usually wear a bow tie, but I thought this was a fitting photo. I started at the Huffington Post a little over 3 years ago. I started as a reporter and as an editor on the editorial side before moving down to the branded content team. So I approach a lot of these topics first and foremost from an editorial and from an audience-first perspective. When I began on the branded content team, there was only 2 or 3 of us, and all we knew is that we had these sponsorships or these partnerships with brands that seemed to be very successful and that people wanted more of. And the question we were asking ourselves is, how can we replicate and really scale this model? Now, at the time, the industry was sort of being built around us, so we didn't have any of the vocabulary that we have today. We didn't use words like branded content, native advertising. It was much simpler, but we also didn't really know what we were onto. And so as the Huffington Post was really developing our strategy, the industry itself was also developing sort of a series of best practices. And based on that, we've had a lot of observations that have sort of informed our approach. So I used to live in California. I'm a West Coaster. I lived on the beach for many years, and so I really loved the sunshine. I studied English and philosophy before doing my master's degree in political studies. So again, I approach a lot of these issues from a theoretical, from a philosophical sense. I like to dig into the words and really understand the meaning behind them. I left California a little over 3 years ago to come to New York. So I traded the peace and the tranquility of the ocean for the hustle and bustle of New York. It's been a bit of an adjustment, but I like the city. So basically, I traded my family, my friends, and all of the fun things that were going on in LA for the long winters of New York. I think I need a new coat, but I'm not really built for winter, so it's tough. So at the Huffington Post, my main objective is to deliver both clients and readers authentic value through content. And so again, we're going to dive into this a little bit deeper, but I wanted to start with this sort of proposed definition to, one, understand 2 of the key stakeholders that we're working with in native advertising, which are clients and our readers, and then really understand this idea of offering authentic value through content. And what that means is not just paying lip service to one or the other, but really achieving some sort of result that is going to benefit that party. So here's one of our case studies, and this was a branded content platform, a larger partnership that we did with Chipotle. Chipotle is a Mexican chain restaurant in the United States. It's very popular. What they decided to do with us was to sort of own the conversation around GMOs, pesticides, and organic food. Now, again, this had nothing to do, well, it was related to their core product offering, but what they didn't want to do, or what they allowed us to do, was not necessarily focus on their core product offering. We weren't writing listicles about 5 things that are great about Mexican food, but they were aligning with a topic that people were very passionate about in the States, and the results really showed the resonance with our audience. 3.9 million page views, 52% engagement rate, 1 million social actions, and several awards over the 6 or 7 months that it ran. Another example of some of the work that we've done is the global motherhood platform with Johnson & Johnson. And it's the same thing. You know, Johnson & Johnson has a number of brands and they create a number of products, but what they really wanted to do was align along with this very passionate conversation across the globe about maternal health and infant mortality. So what we did is we set up the section that's all about content around providing the support, especially in underserved countries, to help mothers. And again, the results sort of speak for themselves. They saw a 15-point lift in brand perception, 207 million Twitter mentions of their hashtag, and won several awards for the platform. So I wanted to start off with those couple examples to give you a sense of where we finally landed, but to go back a little bit and understand the story of the Huffington Post, it might be useful to take a look at this timeline. We were founded in 2005 by Ariana Huffington in her home in Beverly Hills in Los Angeles. In 2009, we were named by Time to be one of the 25 best blogs of the year. And that's something that's really important to our DNA at the Huffington Post, which is a two-way dialogue with people and to allow a lot of different voices to be represented on our platform. In 2010, we launched the first iteration of what is today known as the Huffington Post Partner Studio. That's the team that I'm on. That's our creative in-house team that's in charge of running, brainstorming, executing native advertising campaigns. We were acquired by AOL in 2011, and that really set the stage for our international expansion. They provided us with the resources and the support that allowed us to expand outside of the US market, and that was also the beginning of what has become a very robust technological platform that supports all of our editorial efforts. So today, that partnership, that relationship between AOL and Huffington Post is continuing to develop. So now we come to 2014 when we became the #1 publisher on Facebook, and we launched our first ever agency content partnership with Leo Burnett. So now that it's been 10 years, we're sort of reflecting back on the last 10 years to see where we've come and where we're going. So we talk about how Huffington Post is the place where content meets technology. So globally we have 850 staff, which is actually quite small given the scale that we reach. 1,700 stories published per day. 100,000 bloggers registered on our blogging platform, and there's a new piece of content published every 58 seconds, and that allows us to reach somewhere around 200 global unique visitors, and that's each month. So to give you a sense of our scale as it stacks up domestically, we're at 93 million cross-platform US UVs, and then globally that number goes up towards 200 million. So I want to give you a sense again of where Huffington Post has come to sort of establish, our approach and all of the different things that we've experimented with and all the things that are very key to our DNA, because that very much informs our native advertising strategy. So let's get right into what exactly is native advertising. And again, this is something that's going to be hotly debated today, I think. We already had some great conversations yesterday about the distinctions and the sort of fine-tuning of these terms. So at the Huffington Post, we use the words native advertising and branded content interchangeably. But the reason to do that was very intentional, and that's based on certain analyses that we've made on each of these words. So native advertising, at its core, is advertising. Advertising that appears in native format, meaning that it matches the form and the function of the platform on which it appears. And so advertising at its core is there to benefit a brand or a brand's product or a brand's service. Now, on the other hand, branded content at its core is content. It's a modification of content. And it's content that is either paid by or influenced in some way by a brand. And content, as we all know, is mainly meant to benefit readers, and it does that by informing or educating or entertaining or inspiring. And so at face value, these two things seem different. They're meant to achieve different goals. But at the Huffington Post, we don't see this as an or proposition. We see it as an and proposition. And so every time we create a piece of native advertising or a piece of branded content, we want to make sure that we're achieving both goals and that we're doing both things that advertising or content would want us to do. So every piece of content should be benefiting a brand or a product or a service, and every piece of content should be offering readers authentic value through those means. So what isn't native advertising? If that's sort of our proposed definition, which is content that is benefiting clients and readers and offering them some sort of real, authentic value, native advertising isn't advertorial. So we like to use the dinner party metaphor. And at a dinner party, people engage in conversation, they listen just as much as they speak, and they look for ways that they can add value or add something to the conversation. Whereas an advertorial we like to think of as someone jumping on top of the dinner table and screaming at everybody. It's a one-way conversation. So this isn't done in collaboration necessarily with others, but is really an opportunity for a brand to talk about whatever it wants. And again, that has its own value, and there can be uses for advertorial. But in the sense of native advertising, it doesn't necessarily achieve all of our stated goals. It's also not specific to an audience or a platform. Advertorial is meant, again, to represent the brand's voice and not necessarily speak to one audience over another. And then finally, there's not necessarily any inherent value for readers. And again, that doesn't mean that advertorial can't offer readers value, but at its core, advertorial doesn't need to. I'm sure we've all seen and read advertorials that are great and entertaining, but a majority of the time, they don't necessarily offer that value. So based on these things, we sort of come to another proposed definition, maybe a little more built out, of what is native advertising. So this is inspiring, educational, and or entertaining native content that increases brand awareness, purchase consideration, or another key brand metric. So where did this come from? Obviously, this is a big, big topic. We've been speaking about it for years. It's obviously the focus of media agencies, publishers, marketers, but it's not necessarily a new idea. David Ogilvy, who started Ogilvy and Mather in 1948 and was very active in the advertising scene in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, he also wrote several books on advertising, recognized the value of advertisements that don't necessarily fit the standard model of what advertising is. There's no need for advertisements to look like advertisements. If you make them look like editorial pages, you will attract about 50% more readers. Now, I'm not sure if that statistic necessarily pans out today, but the idea that this was identified back 50, 40 years ago reminds us that native advertising is not necessarily a new invention. This was something that David Ogilvy did for Guinness, his guide to oysters. And again, this isn't Guinness's core product offering. He's not creating a guide to drinking Guinness. It's a related topic to the experience of drinking Guinness, and it's offering readers real value that doesn't necessarily reflect the brand's product. Another example is the Michelin guide. And of course, Michelin is a tire company, but they decided to create this guide that is meant to inform travelers about good restaurants, good places to visit. The idea being that when you think about travel, you think about modes of transportation, you think about cars, you think about tires. So again, I think one of our big challenges when we work with native advertising is getting brands to think about the big picture. Oftentimes they have very limited KPIs that they want to achieve. They want to sell product. They want to increase brand awareness. They want to increase purchase consideration. But if you really get them to expand their vision of what's possible, you can develop a much deeper relationship with consumers, and down the line, that's going to lead to those other results. Other examples are the furrow, which was published in the late 1800s by John Deere, which is an American farm manufacturer. And the furrow was all about providing seasonal insights into farming for farmers. And so again, this is not anything new, but in recent years, we've seen these terms really shoot up the charts in terms of how much we talk about them. Content marketing is another word that we sometimes use. I think it fits in the same spectrum as native advertising or branded content, but it's sometimes useful when speaking with marketers to sort of be on their playing field, but we really stick with native advertising or branded content at Huffington Post. And so again, this term has shot up, and because of that, there's been a lot of attention spent on it, and we're having these great conversations like today to really understand the impact and potential of native advertising. So we really believe that this recent rise, despite the fact that this is not a new tool in any way, is due to three key trends. And those three trends are mobile, video, and social. We've seen, as many publishers have seen, a drastic increase in mobile traffic, and it's no longer just desktop users who are also on their phone, but desktop traffic is actually declining while mobile is still increasing. There's a much higher rate of video consumption, at least in the United States, and people are spending a majority of their video consumption time on their mobile devices. And then social is the new front page. I was actually very skeptical of this when people were talking about it a couple of years ago. I thought that people would still rely on journalists, would rely on publishers to give them the content that they needed that would be most beneficial to them. But people have found that social feeds are generally more effective in terms of delivering the content that they want. And so these three trends have really presented us with three key challenges to address in the publishing industry. We have reduced screen real estate because we've got much smaller screens to work with today. There's less engagement with the type of content that we can display on those smaller screens. And then there's reduced monetization potential because these formats are generally smaller and more simple than you could put on a large display on desktop. And one thing I want to mention about these challenges is that I don't believe that I believe that every trend, every change in user behavior is inherently a good thing. It means that users are finding a better way to access and to consume content. So despite the fact that obviously for us it's a very big challenge as content creators, as advertisers, as creatives, to figure out what to do with this smaller screen, the fact is that for users, for consumers, they are finding that's a better way to access content. We need to do whatever we can to understand that trend and then capitalize on it. And so because of these three challenges that we're facing because of these original trends, we believe that native advertising offers three key benefits. It's more effective use of inline space because you no longer have to worry about taking up a lot of the screen with a big display ad, but the content itself is driving those brand metrics and is driving that user engagement and that relationship. There's more engagement with content. This was mentioned earlier. There's much more engagement with content than there is with display ads. And then there's higher CPM potential with these premium formats. And so again, while there's more engagement with this content, I think that we shouldn't be too harsh to judge display ads based on their engagement or click-through rates, because at the end of the day, that shouldn't be the purpose of display ads. And I'll get into this in a moment when we talk about different tools, but we really want to understand what the purpose of each tool and how it can be best used. So yes, native advertising is this big new trend. Everyone's talking about it. Everyone's trying to get into it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's easy. And so this is a famous example in the States where The Atlantic, and this was several years ago at the beginning of the industry, where they published this native ad for the Church of Scientology. And you can see here that it is labeled, it does say sponsor content, but at the time people weren't familiar at all with the format, and your first instinct as a user when you come to this article is, The Atlantic either wrote some article that was sponsored by Church of Scientology or just wrote this article on how great the Church of Scientology is, which would be a very strange thing to see on The Atlantic based on their other content. And so because of this article and because of all the negative press that it received, the industry really started off on rocky footing in the United States. And since then, we've sort of been facing an uphill battle, and a lot of publishers are very hesitant to get into it. A lot of marketers can be hesitant to get into it because of all the negative press that led from this. We have also examples from BuzzFeed. 21 times HBO is the source of all your happiness, and BuzzFeed does a lot of great things, and I don't mean to disparage them in any way, but this is a good example of native advertising that is way too branded. Again, we looked at those examples of the Guinness Guide to Oysters or the Michelin Guide or other native ads that we have seen perform really well, and they're not going to be so direct in terms of trying to sell the brand. And so this is a listicle of each show that HBO produces with a little animated GIF of a character from that show. And so if you were a user to click into that user experience would, again, be sort of dissonant. And then at the bottom is this headline, "This life-saving technology delivers superhuman sight when you need it most." This is a great headline. This is something that I'd be interested in clicking, and this is a very compelling topic. But what happens is when you click into the article, you see that the article was written by, it was an advertorial written by a brand that creates the technology that they're writing about. So despite the fact that we might even have some very real organic interest in this product, the fact is that as a user, when you click on that and you get into that experience, you get this sort of gut check or a punch in the stomach where you realize, oh, I'm no longer interested in this because this brand is just trying to sell some technology that they're creating. And so from these sort of learnings and from these conversations, we've come to 3 keys to good native. Number 1 is quality editorial content. That means that content creators, people who are experts in creating content that goes viral, that is shareable, and they can really come from a variety of backgrounds. We found that to have a team with a diverse array of backgrounds is really best because it allows us to see things in a lot of different ways. But it's very important at the end of the day that the end result is quality and that our users are going to engage with it. It's data-driven, meaning that we conduct several different ways of gaining statistics and data before we even start the creative process. And that can be editorial insights that we use from our editorial dashboards, just looking at articles that have performed well and which audiences are reading which content. And that can also be larger studies. We did one study called a max diff analysis and a emotional analysis, which basically gauges, is a large study over the course of weeks that gauges our users' interest in a variety of topics. And so we use these statistical analyses to really inform the creative process. Not overly influence it, but to really give our creatives a starting point or some sort of guidelines to continue that creative process. As was mentioned earlier, if you have a driver's license and you're just told to drive somewhere, that's a very difficult task because the possibilities are endless. But by giving some sort of parameters to that process, you can help inform the direction that a creative campaign can go. And then authentic distribution at scale. The reason that I've underlined authentic is that I think often publishers or marketers think, well, if this person has a social following of 1 million people or 2 million people on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, then we can just push this content out there and it's going to perform well and it's going to do well. The fact is that social audiences are very fickle. They have a lot of different options in terms of what content they can spend their time with. And because of that, if you don't speak with them on the level that they're used to, they will go somewhere else. You will lose users and you'll alienate your audience. And so we really believe that before you ask a social network or a social channel to publish a piece of content, that it actually makes sense for that audience. And then at scale is something that we believe is very important. We are fortunate to have, again, 15 international editions and a large audience. But whatever the scale is that you have, it's important to reach the target population and also a lot of them. So going to mention that right now we are in 15 countries, 15 markets around the world. We just launched Australia a couple weeks ago, and now we have plans to launch in China and Mexico. So getting in the second section, native advertising's relationship with display and how the two can work together. And when I think about these things, I think of a toolbox. I mentioned tools earlier. But really, as a beginning craftsman, you start off with only a couple tools, and because of that, your results are very awkward or forced sometimes. If you're forced to drive a nail into a piece of wood with a wrench or pull apart two boards with a screwdriver, not only are you going to damage your tools, but the result is not going to be there. But as you add more tools to that toolbox, you allow each individual tool to do its job better, and the end result is better. And so really with native advertising, what we're doing is we're adding another tool to our toolbox, and if we use it the right way, again, that end result will follow. So right here we have a Huffington Post article. This is a native ad, and this is just the content itself. So it's an interesting headline. It's clearly labeled. I don't know if you can see on this screen, but there's a gray box at the top explaining the brand relationship. And then the article itself doesn't have a lot of direct brand mentions. This was an article sponsored by Dixie, and Dixie makes paper plates and paper towels, and they really want to be associated with the idea of the mealtime tradition. The thinking going that if people think about Dixie when you're eating lunch or dinner, you think about those paper towels and those plates. And so what that allowed us to do was to write this really interesting and cool cultural comparison about different mealtime traditions from around the world. And so this article, its goal is to provide authentic value to readers and to develop a stronger relationship through that value exchange. Now, on the other hand, we have display ads. And these display ads have a different goal in mind. It's a different tool. Display ads are meant to increase things like brand awareness, brand affinity, or brand recall. And again, in and of themselves, there's nothing inherently wrong with display. But if you were to come to this page, you wouldn't share this, you wouldn't interact with this. It would be a very odd experience. However, together and working together, these two things can really achieve a powerful result. The user who is used to display placements and used to where they appear on the site can still read this article and get whatever value or entertainment they want out of it, while at the same time, these display ads are going to drive whatever those brand results the brand who's paying for this article want. You can also see here, and in this next example here that was done with State Farm, and State Farm is an insurance company, and they really wanted to own the idea, not of insurance, but of the home, and because of the home of the neighborhood. So if you see these two large display ads on the side, they're also very interactive display ads. They have video embedded. They have a curated content stream below. And what we found is that our users have a much higher threshold for the number of display ads that appear on a page if it's custom content created by that brand. And so you see here that these are two separate studies done, one on unaided recall of sponsor and one on purchase consideration. And again, our users have a higher threshold for display presence, not necessarily brand integration in the article itself, but of the surrounding media. And so with the unaided recall of sponsor, we saw a 7% lift in the ability of people to recall which sponsor sponsored that piece of content. And that's no surprise, right? If you look at these two examples before, you see 1, 2, maybe 3 or 4 different brand mentions, which can feel like a lot. But again, if the article is quality and users are used to seeing display ads in those places, they have a much higher threshold for the amount of branding. Now, in the second study done around purchase consideration, we saw a 16% lift in people that were consuming a piece of custom content sponsored by an advertiser. So again, we don't believe that display ads are obsolete. We believe that they can work very well when they are trying to achieve their stated goal. So we come back to this idea of native advertising, branded content, really combining the best elements of advertising and content to achieve a given result. So now getting into the final section, the future of content. Again, I just want to propose sort of 2 potential worlds that we could see should certain trends or decisions that both publishers and marketers are making continue. And so the first one is a distributed world, and this distributed world is really summed up by this quote by Jonah Peretti. Jonah Peretti is the founder and CEO of BuzzFeed. He also used to work at Huffington Post, and he said this quote at a Recode conference just a couple months ago. And so while the quote itself is actually not really revelatory, these are things that a lot of publishers and everyone is seeing and understanding in the marketplace. The fact that he came out and said something so strong signaled to me that this is a very transformative moment in the publishing industry. For a CEO of a publisher to come out and say, it doesn't matter whether it appears on our site or whether it appears in BuzzFeed's app, whether it appears on YouTube or Facebook or other platforms, has a lot of profound implications for the way that we're going to think about content creation going forward. And so in this distributed world, there's going to be a couple different consequences. I think brands as publishers won't really operate the same way they do today. If you're accessing content, we all know when we go on our Facebook feeds or our Twitter feeds, it's becoming less and less important which brand is producing that content, and more important what the content is itself. And because of that, it's going to be much harder for publishers to stand out and really differentiate themselves. I think we're going to see sort of a coalescing in the middle of people who understand what performs well on Facebook, or, again, going back to Jonah's quote, he doesn't care if it appears on Facebook or YouTube or other platforms. And what that means is it's going to need to be able to fit everywhere. And because that content is no longer going to feel extremely specific to that platform, it's going to be hard to create native content if it's meant to live everywhere. So in this distributed world, we're also going to see programmatic native, and there's a lot of talk around this now. And I think at the end of the day, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding a subclass to the content spectrum. So at one end, if we have display, and the other end, we have pure editorial content. In the middle right now, we have native advertising, which again is achieving both goals. But with native programmatic, I think we're going to see sort of a subset in between native advertising and display, where articles are fed through an automated marketplace to appear in your newsfeed. And just to back up one step for those of you that might not be as familiar with programmatic or weren't here last year for the conference. Programmatic is the idea that a publisher is going to offer certain ad slots on an automated marketplace that marketers can then come and place bids with their display units. And so what's going to happen is, and then if that bid wins, obviously that display ad is served in all those ad slots at a given time to a given audience. Now there's talks about doing the exact same thing with content. But based on a couple of the different options that are available now with third-party programmatic distributors, there's a lot of details to work out, and it's going to be very difficult for third parties to be able to automate the analysis of a piece of content to best understand which audience that piece of content should fit. And in this distributed world, it's going to become democratized, which is a good thing. Allows any of us to become content creators. You can, on the Huffington Post, again, we have over 100,000 people registered on our blog platform who can publish an article on our site. You have other platforms like Medium. You have platforms like Slant that allow people to really build their own audiences. But because of that democratization, I think we're going to see a fragmentization of the audience. Just as we're seeing on YouTube now, where there are these YouTube influencers with 1 million, 2 million, 3 million followers, they don't need to worry about appealing to a wide, broad audience. All they need to worry about is appealing to those 1 or 2 million people that follow their channel. And because of that, I'm sure some of you have checked out some of these YouTube influencers. Some of it can seem very strange. I frankly don't understand a lot of it, but the fact is that there are people that love that type of content and the relationship they have. But in the case of the YouTube, these influencers are the brand. So you know exactly who's creating it, and if that creator were taken out of the equation, that audience would cease to exist. Whereas I mentioned earlier with this publishing brands, to make sure that people remember which publisher is creating that content is going to become increasingly difficult. So within this fragmented audience that we're going to see where individual creators are developing their own followers, it's going to be a real challenge for publishers and marketers to reach audiences at scale and to reach the audiences they want. And so then, branded newsrooms. So branded newsrooms are the idea that a brand, instead of working with a publisher to create content, are just going to hire their own editorial staffs to create exactly the type of content they want. And so we're already seeing this with companies like Uber, Sweetgreen, Casper, West Elm, and a couple others have already created their own editorial staffs. What that allows them to do is really create content at lower cost and create the exact type of content that they want. But the issue is that what happens is they have this stable of content. They have these 20 or 30 articles they've created, and then they have no audience or distribution network to actually get that to people. So then they come to a publisher and say, hey, we've got this great content. We'd love to run it on your site. And publishers are going to need to make the decision about whether they're going to allow brands who have created content in a vacuum to publish that content on their site. At the Huffington Post, we do have a product called a brand blog, and that does allow brands to write their own content, but it's always in conjunction with our editorial staff offering feedback, edits, and tweaks to make sure that it feels native to the platform. And so we're going to see this increasingly as brands try to understand what makes the most sense for their strategy, and it's going to be increasingly important what decision publishers make when that opportunity presents itself. And then in another world, we have a collaborative world. In a collaborative world, publishers, marketers, media agencies are all working together from the beginning to achieve a combined goal. And so that's going to offer the opportunity for things like real-time native, which is predicated on the notion that you agree upon a concept beforehand and then allow the creative team to really create that content in real time. And so you can respond to daily news events, to daily and weekly trends, and create highly relevant and topical content that we found performs better. It won't necessarily have the long tail effect of like an evergreen piece of content, but at the same time, it's a very powerful tool should a brand and a publisher, a brand and a publisher achieve a relationship and get on the same page.